Story number 1. Disappering Path. Damon had always found solace in nature. The quiet rustle of leaves, the crisp scent of pine, and the rhythmic crunch of dirt beneath his boots gave him a peace that city life never could. This weekend was supposed to be an escape, a solo hiking trip through the dense expanse of Black Hollow Forest, a place notorious among locals for its labyrinthine trails and eerie legends. But Damon thrived on the thrill of the unknown. The first day was uneventful. Damon set up camp near a clear brook, cooked a modest meal, and watched the stars pierce through the canopy above. The forest was alive with nocturnal sounds, owls hooting, leaves rustling in the breeze. It was perfect. On the second day, Damon packed his gear and decided to explore deeper. He discovered a narrow path, partially hidden by overgrown brush and marked by a faded wooden sign with barely legible letters. Whispering Trail. It wasn't on his map. His curiosity ignited. Damon stepped onto the trail. The path twisted unnaturally, snaking through dense thickets and towering trees that seemed to lean inward, their gnarled branches forming claw-like arches overhead. Despite the bright morning sun, shadows lingered unnervingly. Damon shrugged it off, attributing the unease to his imagination. Hours passed. Damon checked his compass. The needle spun wildly, refusing to settle. His GPS device showed only a blank screen. When he tried to retrace his steps, the trail had vanished. No broken twigs, no footprints, just an unbroken stretch of dense forest. Panic prickled at the edges of his mind, but Damon forced himself to stay calm. "I'm just tired. I probably missed the marker," he muttered, pressing forward, hoping to find another recognizable landmark. But the deeper he went, the more distorted the forest became. Trees twisted into unnatural shapes, their bark etched with symbols he couldn't decipher. The air grew heavy, thick with a metallic tang. And then there were the whispers, soft, unintelligible voices that seemed to drift with the wind. Damon spun around, but no one was there. Night fell quickly, swallowing the forest in oppressive darkness. Damon set up a makeshift camp, though sleep eluded him. Shadows danced just beyond the flickering light of his campfire, and the whispers grew bolder, almost conversational. By the third day, Damon was desperate. He marked trees with his knife, but when he circled back, the marks were gone. He rationed his food and water, but exhaustion gnawed at him. His reflection in a stagnant puddle revealed hollow eyes and a face drawn with fear. That evening, he saw it, a figure standing between the trees. Not an animal, not another hiker, human-like, but wrong. Its limbs were too long, its movements jerky, as if struggling to mimic walking. Damon shouted, but the figure didn't respond. Instead, it tilted its head, then disappeared behind a tree. When Damon rushed over, there was nothing. Mind frayed. Time lost meaning. He found himself walking in circles, encountering the same fallen log, the same twisted tree, even though he was sure he'd changed direction. Hunger gnawed at his insides. Thirst burned his throat. The forest seemed to pulse with a life of its own, breathing in sync with his ragged gasps. On what he assumed was the fifth day, Damon stumbled into a clearing. In the center stood an ancient stone arch, covered in moss and those strange symbols. Beyond it, the forest looked different, lighter, almost welcoming. Desperate, he stepped through. Instantly, the air changed. The whispers ceased. The forest beyond the arch was eerily silent. Damon turned back, but the arch was gone. No clearing, no stones, just dense forest. He was still lost, But this forest felt even less familiar. The sky above was wrong, tinged with colors he couldn't name. Trees loomed with faces etched into their bark, and shadows moved without light. Damon realized the horrifying truth. He hadn't found a way out. He'd stepped deeper in, and the path was still disappearing. Story number 2, The Forgotten Orphanage.
Lucas Carter had always chased the truth, no matter where it led. As an investigative journalist, his specialty was unraveling mysteries, especially those that people wanted to forget. So when an anonymous tip landed in his inbox with nothing but an old, yellowed photograph of a decrepit orphanage and the words, "Find the children," he was hooked. St. Mary's Home for Children had been shut down decades ago, and those stories of abuse and neglect had surfaced over the years. Nothing ever came of them. What intrigued Lucas most was what followed. Families who had adopted children from St. Mary's reported that within months, their children had vanished without a trace. No evidence, no leads, just silence. As for those who remained at the orphanage, they were never seen or heard from again after the place closed its doors. Lucas arrived in the small, forgotten town of Black Hollow just as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky a sickly shade of orange. The orphanage stood at the edge of town, its Gothic architecture looming like a specter over the landscape. It had been abandoned for over 30 years, yet something about it felt occupied. He stepped onto the cracked pavement leading up to the entrance, his breath visible in the unseasonal chill. The townspeople had been tight-lipped when he asked about the place, their eyes darting away at the mere mention of St. Mary's. He was alone in this. With a deep breath, he pushed the front door. It groaned open, revealing a darkened hallway lined with peeling wallpaper and the faint scent of mildew. The silence inside was suffocating. His flashlight flickered as he stepped inside, the beam catching dust particles floating in the air like lost souls. And then he heard it, a whisper, a child's voice. "Mother is waiting." Lucas followed the whisper into the main hall, his heart pounding against his ribs. His rational mind told him it was the wind, but deep down he knew better. He made his way to what had once been the director's office. The desk was overturned, papers scattered across the floor, but one thing stood out. A small wooden box sitting perfectly upright on a dusty shelf. Inside were old cassette tapes, labeled with names he didn't recognize. He picked up the first tape and placed it into his recorder. Static crackled before a soft, trembling voice emerged. "My name is Daniel. I don't like it here. Mother watches us at night. She tells us stories, but they don't make sense. She says we belong to her. I don't want to belong to her." Lucas's blood ran cold. He played the next tape. "Mother has long arms. She touches us when we sleep. She whispers things we can't remember when we wake up. The others are leaving, but they don't come back. I heard Sister Agnes crying. She said we were never meant to leave." The voice broke into quiet sobs before the tape cut off abruptly. Lucas rewound the tape, his mind racing. Who was Mother? A caretaker? Or something else entirely? A floorboard creaked behind him. He spun around, flashlight shaking. But there was no one there. Determined, Lucas searched the orphanage room by room. He found old beds still covered in dust, broken toys scattered across the floors, and eerie drawings on the walls. Children holding hands with a looming black figure standing over them. In the basement, he discovered a locked door marked "Staff Only." Took some effort, but he managed to break it open. Inside, rows of small beds lined the walls. Crude restraints dangled from their sides. The room smelled of decay and something worse, something old. At the center of the room stood a single crib, untouched by time. Inside was a tattered doll with button eyes. As Lucas reached for it, his recorder suddenly crackled to life in his pocket. "You were meant to come here." His breath hitched. The voice was different this time. Older. A woman's voice. A sudden knock echoed through the room. 3 slow, deliberate taps. Then silence. Lucas turned, but the doorway was empty. Every instinct told him to run, but he had come too far. He played another tape, his hands trembling. "Mother needs more children," a child's voice whispered. "She is hungry. She doesn't like when they leave. She makes them stay." The tape distorted, warping into something unnatural, before cutting out entirely. Then something moved in the shadows. A tall, skeletal figure stepped forward, its form flickering as though struggling to remain in this reality. Long, thin arms extended outward, and its face. There was no face, just shifting darkness. Lucas stumbled back as the entity glided toward him. The air around him grew heavy, suffocating. Whispers filled the room, overlapping voices of children crying, pleading, "Join us!" They wept. "She is waiting." The figure reached out, its elongated fingers grazing his shoulder. Ice shot through his veins. He felt himself slipping, his vision blurring as if being pulled into something far beyond comprehension. He screamed. The world went dark. When Lucas awoke, the orphanage was gone. Or rather, he was gone from it. He found himself standing in a field where the building once stood, his camera missing. His recorder melted into an unrecognizable lump of plastic. The town of Black Hollow had no record of St. Mary's. No one remembered it ever existing. But Lucas remembered, and so did they. That night, as he lay in his motel room, unable to sleep, a whisper tickled his ear. "Mother is still hungry." His reflection in the mirror smiled, and he did not.
Story number 3. Pixelated Doom.
Jake Morgan, a college student obsessed with retro games, stumbles upon a strange cartridge at a flea market. The label is worn, with only the faint word Noctis visible. The vendor, an old man with a vacant expression, warns Jake not to play it after midnight. Ignoring the warning, Jake loads the game on his old CRT TV. The game seems like a simple 8-bit horror platformer, but as he progresses, the pixelated world becomes disturbingly familiar. The first level is an exact replica of his apartment. As he moves through the game, objects in his real-life apartment shift subtly, mirroring the changes in the game. A shadowy figure appears in both the game and his peripheral vision. When he tries to turn off the console, the power button doesn't respond. Jake spends the next hour trying everything to turn off the console, but it's as if the game refuses to let go. His heartbeat quickens as the figure moves closer in the game, while in his room, the air grows thick, suffocating. At exactly 12:01 a.m., the game suddenly shuts off on its own, leaving Jake staring at his reflection in the blank TV screen. But his reflection isn't right. It's smiling and he isn't. Strange dreams plague him that night, dreams of pixelated corridors stretching infinitely, of distorted voices whispering his name. When he wakes up, the cartridge is no longer where he left it. It's back in the console, waiting. Jake wakes up to find his TV still on, the game's title screen looping. A new level has been unlocked overnight, one that wasn't there before. The character in the game now bears a striking resemblance to him, down to his clothes and a small scar on his wrist. As he plays, he hears faint whispers from the speakers. The game describes his actions before he even makes them. When he tries to uninstall it, the file reinstalls itself. Disturbed, he searches online for information about Noctis, but no records exist. That night, his dreams are filled with pixelated images and distorted sounds. A message appears on the screen. Keep playing. Jake starts to see the game change in real time. The level design now incorporates aspects from his past. A childhood home, his high school, places he hasn't thought of in years. A familiar voice calls out from the screen, and he realizes it belongs to someone he knew. A friend who died in an accident years ago. His hands shake as he navigates the game, the pixels shifting erratically. Suddenly, his screen flashes, and a single frame of a distorted face appears, something almost human but broken. The power in his apartment flickers. The message says, "You can't stop." More events spiral out of control. The game predicts his future, showing him events before they happen. A knock at the door appears in the game mere seconds before he hears it in reality. Objects in his apartment rearrange themselves to match their placement in the game. His phone screen glitches, showing fragments of his own face merged with the pixelated character. Jake starts to feel the lines between reality and the game blur dangerously, and the more he plays, the harder it becomes to tell what's real. Jake starts seeing glitches in the real world. People's faces blur momentarily, street signs flicker like bad pixels, and his reflection distorts into a blocky figure. Desperate, he contacts a game historian, Mark, who reluctantly agrees to help. Mark tells him that urban legends about Noctis date back to the 1980s. Players who reached a certain level either disappeared or went insane. Mark attempts to analyze the code, but his computer crashes each time he tries to open the files. As Jake plays further, the game reveals his worst fears. Scenes of himself in the hospital, his body twisted into unnatural positions, messages flashing. "Is this how it ends?" He refuses to continue, but that night, he wakes up with his fingers moving involuntarily, gripping the controller. The game is playing itself, and his in-game character is trapped in a dark corridor, unable to move forward. Then, a new message appears. He is here. Jake feels something in the room with him. He turns sharply but sees nothing, until his screen flickers and a shadow in the game moves, without him pressing a button. The whispers from the TV grow louder, transforming into something akin to static laced with screams. Desperate, he throws the console against the wall, but instead of breaking, it simply reappears back on his desk, powered on. A new option appears on the menu, Last Chance. Jake realizes the game is a conduit for something sinister. The shadowy figure he saw in the game now lurks in his apartment, its distorted, pixelated face flickering between frames of reality. He hears it breathing behind him. Each night, it moves closer. Mark arrives, only to find Jake unresponsive, staring blankly at the screen. The game now has a live feed of Jake's room, displaying Mark standing behind him. Panicked, Mark tries unplugging the console, but the game doesn't shut off. The entity steps forward from the screen, glitching between pixels and reality. The walls of the apartment darken, filled with binary code. Jake screams as the figure reaches for him, and the screen goes black. The TV flickers back on. The game resumes, but Jake is gone. Mark stares at the screen, trembling. The character on screen now has Jake's face. A new message appears. Player 1 has been claimed. Mark turns to leave but finds himself unable to move. The walls around him begin shifting, his surroundings replaced by a pixelated landscape. He realizes he is now inside the game. Mark wakes up in an unfamiliar place, a world rendered in crude, 8-bit graphics. He sees Jake's avatar wandering aimlessly, trapped. A message appears, only one can leave. Mark realizes he's now inside the game, and Jake is gone. The only way out is to win, but the game's levels have changed, morphing into terrifying landscapes filled with pixelated horrors. He fights through glitched-out monsters, searching for a way to escape. Meanwhile, in the real world, Jake's body sits motionless, eyes wide open but lifeless. His computer screen blinks with a new message. Player 2 has entered. The game is still waiting for its next victim. Mark fights through level after level, his heart racing. Every mistake costs him dearly. Pain shoots through his limbs, as if the game punishes failure with real suffering. The final boss approaches, a grotesque fusion of corrupted pixels and screaming faces. Mark must make a choice. Sacrifice himself or let Jake remain trapped forever. The screen distorts, and the entity's voice seeps through. A winner must be chosen. Mark hesitates, the reality of his decision crushing him. He tries to call out to Jake, but all he hears is static. With no other choice, he plunges forward into the final battle. The screen fades to black. In the real world, Jake's body finally moves, but when he lifts his head, his eyes glow an unnatural shade of green, the screen reflecting something inhuman. A new game appears on an online auction site, its label barely legible, but 2 words can still be made out: Noctis Lives.
Story number 4. The Apartment Upstairs. Ethan had always preferred quiet living, which is why apartment 3B seemed perfect. It was cheap, clean, and located in a peaceful neighborhood on the outskirts of Portland, Oregon. The landlord, Mr. Jenkins, was an elderly man with thick glasses and a habit of muttering to himself. When Ethan signed the lease, Jenkins gave a peculiar warning. "Don't worry about noises from upstairs. The place has been empty for years." Ethan laughed it off, thinking it was just a quirky landlord trying to add some charm to the rundown building. But the first night told a different story. At exactly 3:15 a.m., Ethan was jolted awake by the distinct sound of footsteps overhead, slow, deliberate creaks against the wooden floor. He lay in bed, heart pounding, convincing himself it was the building settling or maybe his imagination. But the footsteps continued, night after night, always at 3:15. Curiosity soon outweighed fear. One morning, after another restless night, Ethan decided to investigate. He climbed the dusty staircase to the 4th floor, where apartment 4B should have been. The hallway was colder, the walls stained with water damage, and faded wallpaper peeling at the edges. But there was no apartment 4B, just a bricked-up wall where the door should have been. Confused and unnerved, Ethan confronted Mr. Jenkins. "I thought you said it was empty up there," Ethan said. Jenkins sighed, rubbing his temples. "It is. Has been since the fire." "What fire?" The old man hesitated. "Years ago, a tenant named Claire lived up there. She was troubled. One night, she set a fire. They never found her body. After that, we sealed it up." That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. The footsteps returned, but this time they were accompanied by faint whispers, words he couldn't make out, layered with sadness and rage. Driven by a mix of terror and determination, he grabbed a flashlight and a crowbar, heading upstairs once more. He chipped away at the crumbling plaster, exposing a charred door hidden beneath. Its surface was blackened, the handle rusted with age. Against every instinct screaming in his mind, Ethan opened it. Inside was a small, burned-out apartment frozen in time. Ash-covered furniture, scorched walls, and a mirror hanging crookedly on the far wall. But what made Ethan's blood run cold was the message scrawled across the mirror in soot. "I'm still here." A sudden gust slammed the door shut behind him. The temperature plummeted, and Ethan felt a presence. He turned slowly, the beam of his flashlight trembling. In the corner, a shadow shifted, a figure emerging, her face partially burned, eyes hollow and endless. "Claire." Ethan stumbled backward, trying to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. Claire moved closer, her mouth opening in a silent scream. Ethan felt his mind unravel, darkness creeping in from the edges of his vision. When he awoke, he was in his bed, drenched in sweat. Daylight streamed through the blinds. For a brief moment, he thought it had been a nightmare, until he noticed soot-stained fingerprints on his bedroom mirror, and the faint sound of footsteps upstairs.